Okay, so I left off or got cut off a while ago, right about the time I was plugging 3/8 into 3/8, which is the answer to g of 60, into the f function. So I should be now multiplying 80 times 3/8. Use your calculator, please. This 8 is going to cancel out with that 8, leaving that a 10, and then 30 times 10 is going to leave me 30. And so when I add those together, I get 60. What they want you to see here is that plugging in 60 into the g function and getting 3/8, and then you plugging 3/8 back into the f function, you get 60, which is what you started off with. Okay, so they're trying to show you that those two functions undid each other. Plugging in 60, you got 3/8. When you plugged in 3/8 into the other function, you got 60. Okay, so f of 2, the f function says 30 plus 80 times 2. So 80 times 2 is 160. And that ends up being 190. So now they want us to take 190 and plug it into the g function. So the g function says take the cost, subtract 30, and divide by 80. Okay, so 190 minus 30 would be 160. 160 divided by 80, and you would get 2. Okay, so again, they're trying to see that plugging in 2 into the f function gives you a value. You take that value, plug it into the g function, and you get what you started off with. Okay, so they're trying to get you to see that there's a cycle. That's because there is a relationship between the f function and the g function. And if you paid attention to what the title of this lesson was, you'll know that they are inverses of each other. Okay, so attend to precision, interpret the meaning of each expression in your correspondence. Be sure to include the units in your explanation. Okay, so for time purposes, we're going to see what Springboard is looking for right here. What they're looking for here is in part A, you can mow 3/8 of an acre for $60. In part B, it costs $60 to mow that number of acres. Part C, it will cost you $190 to mow 2 acres. And in Part D, if you can mow 2 acres, you can now mow 2 acres for the cost of 2 acres. So they're just showing you that there's a relationship. Okay, let's go back to this one. In general, what is the result when you evaluate f of g of x and g of f of x? Again, I'm going to jump over to the teacher's edition so we can save a little bit of time. So in general, you get whatever you plugged in. When we plugged in 60 right here, and we turned it around, we got 60 as the answer. So when you are doing when we are doing inverse functions, when you have two functions that are inverses of each other, whatever you plug in, you turn around and get it out into the inverse. And this is talking about right here that when you have composite functions, okay, the f and g are inverse functions if and only if the domain of this function is also the domain of this one, okay, the inside one. So the domain of this function has to be. We're not going to, we'll worry a little bit more about that, what that means a little bit later. You don't have to worry about these. These are what we call one-to-one functions. And again, once we talk about one-to-one functions, it'll make more sense then. But this is the notation right here that we're going to use to indicate that one function is the inverse of the other. Okay, so now I'm going to switch back to the students edition, and they are showing you what you're going to do. The first thing you're going to do is when you have a function that you're trying to find the inverse of, is rewrite it so that you put the y in the place of the x. Okay, and the reason that you do that is because the second thing you do is you switch the place of x's and y's. And once you switch the place of the x and the y's, you get the y by itself. You now have a new function. And you use the function notation right here to let you know that this function is the inverse of this one. Okay, so let's work some of these problems. All right, I hope I don't run out of room. So here we do. Step number 1, rewrite it so that it says y equals negative 3x plus 8. Step number 1, rewrite it. Step number 2, switch the place of the x and y. Okay, step number 3 now is get the y by itself. So we have to undo everything that's happening to y in the opposite order. So we're going to start by subtracting 8 from both sides. X minus 8 equals negative 3y. Divide everything by negative 3. If it would go evenly, then do it separately. If it won't, then leaving this great big division problem right here is fine. So we end up with y equals x minus 8 divided by negative 3. We created this one, so it is the inverse of the first function. Okay. And that is the answer to A. Okay, the answer to B. Step number 1, I'll change colors. Step number 1, rewrite it. Y equals 1/4 x plus 12. Step number 2, switch places for the x and y. Now we have to get the y by itself. Subtract 12 from both sides. Okay, this says 1/4 times y. Multiply by the reciprocal. Multiply by the reciprocal, both sides. That cancels that with that, and we're left with y equals 4 times x minus 12. Because it's not too difficult to distribute that, you can, but you don't have to. You could leave it 4x minus 12 if you wanted to. Okay, so they want us to write it using function notation. This is the inverse of g of x. So we would write the inverse of g of x is equal to 4x minus 48. Okay, I'm going to do C. Rewrite it using y. Y equals 2/3 x minus 5. Do the opposite of that. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to switch. So we rewrote it with a y. Now we switch the x and y. Okay, now we start undoing by doing the opposite. Add 5. So you have x plus 5 equals 2/3 y. And then we're going to get rid of this by multiplying by the reciprocal. Be careful right here, you got to multiply the whole thing by the reciprocal. That cancels that with that, leaving you y equals, I don't think distributing it's going to make it any simpler, so I'm just going to leave it like that. They want it in function notation. The name of this function is h of x, so the inverse of h of x is equal to 3/2 times x plus 5. Okay. The last one here is j. Rewrite j of x so that it says y equals 3x minus 2 divided by 6. Switch the x and y. Make it be x equal 3y minus 2 divided by 6. Now undo everything that's happening to y. We're saying 3 times y first, then we're subtracting 2, then we're dividing by 6. So that's the last thing that we did, so that's the first thing we're going to undo. So we're going to multiply both sides by 6. So 6x equals 3y minus 2. Add 2 to both sides. Okay, they're not like terms, so we actually can't add them. 6x plus 2